Thousands of people every year visit a California historical landmark, the home of Dr. John Marsh. It's beautifully furnished, and tourists are told that Dr. Marsh was the first medical doctor in California. But the truth is, Dr. Marsh was not a medical doctor. He barely lived in that beautiful mansion. It was never even furnished, and for years it lay desolate. Dr. Marsh was a fraud. Here's his story. After John Marsh graduated from Harvard University with the class of 1823, he decided to explore what was then the Wild West, an area that's now Wisconsin and Minnesota. There he lived with a girl who was part French and part Indian, and they had 2 children, a son and daughter. For the boy, John Marsh felt a particular affection because the little boy had been born with a deformed foot and walked with a limp. Well, now that he had a family, Marsh needed money. He decided better opportunities were out in the California territory, so he decided to go out there and then send for his family. He had just arrived in Southern California when he received a message. It said that the woman and both his children had died. "If I'd had money, I wouldn't have had to leave them," he told friends. "If I'd had money, they'd still be alive. Money, that's what's important." Now it happened that John Marsh had a talent that the people of Los Angeles desperately needed. He had a certain natural skill with sickness, and he knew something about chemistry and herbs. He'd studied physiology, and he knew that to a sick person, a doctor was almost a god. So, John Marsh took out his diploma from Harvard University, which was written in Latin, and asked the local officials to give him a license to practice medicine. They looked at it. Not knowing Latin, they asked a priest visiting from San Gabriel Mission to look it over. The priest studied the impressive calligraphy and nodded approval. After all, it was a diploma. Perhaps that priest hadn't studied Latin either. Anyhow, since nobody there could read it, why not call it a medical degree? And that's how John Marsh became a doctor. Dr. Marsh opened his office near the plaza, and the sick, the poor, and the wounded of Los Angeles came to him for treatment. He took his pay in animal hides, which were often used as the negotiable medium of exchange. 2 years later, in 1838, Dr. Marsh moved to Northern California. He bought extensive property. His ranch stretched from Mount Diablo to the San Joaquin River. Since he was the only doctor in the region, he could charge exorbitant fees, especially when he had to travel. If he was called to San Jose by the Castros, or to Sonoma to treat the Vallejo children, his fee would be as much as 25 to 50 head of cattle. To the poor, he gave little or no help at all. In 1847, Dr. Marsh, an eligible bachelor, received a letter from a friend inviting him to visit the Napa Valley. His friend wrote, "Come on up and visit John. There are 2 young ladies here, well worth the ride." But Marsh was too busy protecting his property from cattle thieves, too busy disciplining the Native Americans he used for slave labor. And then, when gold was struck, he was too busy selling beef to the hungry miners on the Yuba and American rivers. He was too busy getting rich. John Marsh's adobe was known to travelers far and wide, not for its hospitality, but for his inhospitality and hostility. Hungry travelers needing to replenish their supplies would get from Dr. Marsh only enough to take them to the next place. He charged outrageously for every commodity and service. The wise traveler in the West always expected to pay more than the goods were worth, but if he had to buy from Dr. Marsh, he was charged twice what anyone else would have charged. Dr. John Marsh was known and hated from one end of California to the other. And as the years went by, he grew greedier, richer, and more despised. Then, on a trip back east in 1850, Marsh met Abby Tuck, a girl from Massachusetts who was attractive, intelligent, educated, and excited about the new land out west. It was as if Providence had sent her to step into the life of Dr. Marsh. The following year they were married. At first they lived in the old adobe house the Indians had built for Dr. Marsh, but it wasn't very comfortable, and finally the miserly doctor reached into his secret hoard and hired an architect. He told him, "I want you to design one of the finest mansions this state has ever seen." When work on the mansion had just begun, baby Alice was born. Abby had a difficult childbirth. She never did regain her health, and in 1855, after 4 years of marriage, Abby Tuck Marsh died. Well, if Marsh had been bitter and miserly before, this was nothing to what he now became. He had nothing to do with anyone, and when the mansion was finished, although he and baby Alice and a few Indian servants moved in, he never bothered to furnish it. About this time, other troubles began to plague him. Cattle thieves were getting cleverer, more successful at rustling his herds. Squatters were settling on his land. Then he got into a deadly feud with one of his neighbors. Marsh didn't trust anyone. His one obsession was to keep his wealth intact. One night, as he was dozing in his chair by the fire, Marsh was startled by the sudden appearance of a stranger who had just walked into his home. It was a young man, obviously exhausted and hungry. He looked like he'd been traveling for some time. The young man explained that he was looking for food and a place to rest. Dr. Marsh was suspicious. "Get out of my house. Leave this ranch." "Oh, but sir, I'm tired. I've lost my way and I saw your light." "Have you any money?" "No, sir." "A man has no business traveling afoot without money. Where are you from?" "San Francisco. I just arrived yesterday from the States." "Which state?" "Illinois." "What's your name?" "Marsh." "Marsh? Marsh? From Illinois? Where were you born?" "Wisconsin. My father was educated at Harvard and came out west, and my mother died when I was just a few years old, and so I was raised by some people who moved to Illinois." "Listen, what are you here for?" "Well, ever since my mother and little sister died, I've always wanted to come out west. I wanted to know if my father's dead or alive. I have wonderful memories of him. He was a great man. Someone suggested I go to San Joaquin. There's a man named Marsh lives out there. But I got lost." "Take off your boot." "I said take off your boot. Now, your stocking." In embarrassment, the young man showed Dr. Marsh his bare foot, and Marsh saw that the toes were grown together. It seems like a minor miracle that Dr. Marsh and his son should meet in this way. For a while, Charles Marsh was treated like a son, and Dr. Marsh seemed happy. But then they disagreed about something, and Marsh ordered his son out of the house. Charles survived by working in the fields with the Indians. Then in the fall of 1856, Dr. Marsh was traveling by horse and buggy to Martinez when bandits appeared on the road, and he was robbed and murdered. When the bandits were caught, they said they'd been tipped off that Dr. Marsh would be carrying $5,000 in gold. The gold, however, wasn't there. The California courts declared Charles Marsh's legitimate son, so he and Alice inherited the sizable estate. After Marsh's death, the grand old mansion stood neglected, a somber reminder of an unhappy life ruined by selfishness and greed. Today it's preserved as a historical monument. It's a splendid house, beautifully furnished, lovely, and loved. But the man who built it was neither of these.